prices, and last we'll have a look at policy and regulation, because that has been a real factor in 2024 across a whole range of countries. That's not something that we might have said about the cashew sector 5-7 years ago. Big factor nowadays. But let's start just by reflecting on what's different about the second part of the year. What's different about the second half of the year, or more critically, August, December. And these are the factors that I would look at. First of all, 87% of the crop is harvested in that period, January to July, the period just ending today. Only 13% in August, December. Those are the Southern Hemisphere crops. Those are the crops in Brazil, Mozambique, Tanzania, Indonesia. During this period, there's higher consumption almost everywhere. Festivals have a big part to play. We have the Autumn Festival in China. We have Diwali in India, one of the biggest consumption periods. Thanksgiving in North America, and of course Christmas in a number of places right at the end of the year. So buyers may well be active in July and August for those festivals before the festival demand peters out. And then often we see during that period, October, early November, we can then really get a good idea of how demand was for the year, because depending on the market, most buying is done well in advance of the festival. So international buying, so we're talking about markets in Europe, in the Middle East, in North America, most of the international buying is done before June, and the actual physical imports peak mid-year. So it's rare that you get a spike in demand in Europe, for example, because of end-of-year festivals. In fact, in markets that buy forward, buyers will start to focus not on Festival 2024, but on 2025. If they haven't already done so, they'll start to buy for 2025, and they'll decide how much cover, how the prices look, and what their predictions are for demand into next year. It's in this period between August and December that the shortages or the surpluses, or indeed the overreaction or underreaction to those fundamentals, tend to be resolved, and the demand trends tend to show. So the second part of the year in cashews, which we're talking about August to December, during those Southern Hemisphere crops, that's the period when most of the questions are resolved and answered. Will we see that this year? Well, it's not entirely sure, but let's have a look at some of the factors that are influencing that and some of the things that have happened this year so far. We're going to start with production. So I'll give you a quick review across a whole range of countries, major producers of cashews, and we'll start in Asia, and we'll start with the biggest grower of cashews in Asia, Cambodia. And there we've seen some changes this year. Initially, the estimate for the Cambodian crop was around about 1 million tons. That may never have been likely, but it did sink very quickly, where people started to talk about a much smaller crop, as low as 700,000 tons at one stage. But as often happens, especially in cashews, but in a lot of products, the estimates got bigger as the season went on. So the current estimate for the Cambodian crop is 850,000 tons. That hasn't changed since our last session early in July. And it would mean that it is the second largest crop in history. And what's happened is that there were some areas affected by poor weather, but the additional hectares that came online tended to compensate for that. So far, Vietnam reports imports of about 796,000 tons, almost 800,000 tons. Figures differ between agencies in Vietnam. The range is 780 to 796. Either way, it's a lot of cashews. It's almost 800,000 tons. Interestingly, the figures in Cambodia report only 745,000 tons exported. And so at some point, that needs to be reconciled. During the second half of the year, July to December, In the last 2 years, Cambodia exported around about 50,000 tons. So it wouldn't be surprising if that figure grew a little bit and we saw another 50,000 tons trickle back into the markets in Vietnam in the second half of the year. Interestingly, in Cambodia, plantings officially reported now at 580,000 hectares, which fits well with the average yield and this year's crop. But there are dissenting voices to that. There are some studies that estimate the planted area much lower, which doesn't change the crop, but it means that the yield on those hectares is much higher. Interesting in Cambodia, but definitely another successful year for the Cambodian cashew sector. We go to India, the second largest producer in Asia, and that's a different story. So the Indian crop is now finished, or just about finished. The crop is in, and it's certainly lower. There's no official numbers, so I did a survey of opinions of people whose opinion I'd respect, but I got quite a range of estimates. So I got people talking about 20% down. Now, everyone was down. Everyone thought that the crop was smaller than last year and smaller than the expectations. But I got a wide range from 20% down to, in one case, 50% down. But it seemed to be influenced by where the reporter is located. So it looks like the impact on the eastern states is much greater than in the western states. Putting it all together, I'm looking at an estimate somewhere between 600,000 and 625,000 tons. That's not a statistical number. That's a survey of opinions. It's worked in the past. I think this is probably about right. That'd mean it's the worst crop for 10 years in India. So we are looking at significantly lower production, and you would wonder, why are Indian buyers not more active in the raw cashew nut market if their crop is so low? And we'll come back to that a little bit later on. In Vietnam, the third largest producer in Asia, and of course the largest importer, the largest processor and exporter of kernels, we see a lower crop than last year. Again, the area planted to cashews in Vietnam is slowly dropping. Now, there are efforts to reverse that, but it is slowly dropping in favor of other crops. Estimates now are about 300,000 hectares of productive cashew trees. Estimated crop this year, around about 300,000 tons. If someone says it's 320 or 315, I wouldn't argue with them. But it's less than last year. And the focus now in Vietnam appears to more and more be on Cambodia and Laos as potential areas for expansion of regional growing to supply the Vietnamese processing industry. It's interesting in Vietnam that whatever way we look at it, whether it's 315 or 300, that there's only somewhere between 10 and 12% of the processing capacity of Vietnam grown within the country. That is a key factor that determines the way the cashew industry works worldwide. The fact that it's processed in Vietnam and re-exported is also a huge influence, different to India, where, yes, the imports are huge, 1.1 million tons last year, primarily consumed within India. So let's move on and let's have a look at the largest producing region in the world. Somewhere between 48 and 49% of cashews grown in the world will be grown in West Africa this year. We have a quick run around the country, starting with Nigeria. Actually looks like quite a good crop in Nigeria, according to reports. Thanks to African Cashew Alliance reporters. African Cashew Alliance Splits is a pretty good publication that's out every 2 weeks, give you an update on the African cashew market. Estimates in Nigeria between 300 and 350,000 tons. Key factors. This will include some product coming in from Benin. Processors this year are reported to have sourced 60,000 tonnes, which is an increase in processing. In Ghana, the Ghanaian crop is always a little bit difficult to estimate. Ghana is a transit through point for raw cashews from landlocked countries to the north, but also product coming in from Cote d'Ivoire. So we think this year in volume terms it was quite a decent crop, but much lower quality. So we're putting in a crop estimate of about 150,000 tonnes. Earlier estimates and official estimates were more like 200,000 tonnes, but frankly, I'm not buying that. I think 150 is about right. Benin, again, complex case. Actors are estimating a crop of between 140 and 160,000 tonnes. Why is it difficult to estimate the crop? Well, because so much of it, in fact, the bulk of it, is heading in cross-border trade into Togo or into Nigeria due to the export ban. So exports of raw cashew nuts are still not permitted in Benin. And the government, for now at least, seems to accept that illegal trade is inevitable. There were one or two clampdowns, but, you clamp down on export, cross-border export at the end of the season, really it's a gesture. And it's a very difficult thing to control, and it's a very difficult policy to implement. So the season is over. Processing is up. They tell me that processors have sourced about 45,000 tonnes. That's way below their capacity. This year, capacity allowing for a certain scaling up. Capacity could be over 100,000 tonnes, but it'll be way, way underutilized. And probably will continue to be that way until this situation on exports is resolved. Cote d'Ivoire, the crop is in. I don't think there's much left on farms, but there is quite a bit of product left with local traders. That ban on, or more correctly, suspension of raw cashew nut exports is still in place. Incredibly, it's still in place 50 days after the initial loosening of the ban on stocks and warehouses. We expected that would happen much more quickly. I think the CCA would like to lift the ban, but I think they're waiting for permission in a rather turbulent situation there, as you probably have heard. They're waiting for permission to lift that ban. Crop estimates still about 1.1 million tonnes. That's well down on 2023, but it would be a better crop than 2022. So this brings us to an important point. The comparison with 2023 may well give us the impression that crops this year are poor. But if we bear in mind that 2023 was in fact a bumper crop in many countries, it gives us a much more realistic look at it. One thing, though, is certain, and that is that the quality throughout many West African countries this year, due to the weather conditions, is poorer than in previous years. Now, in Cote d'Ivoire, that's complicated by the interruption in the export of raw cashew nuts, where, again, without an adequate infrastructure to store the product, with rain during the season, and with generally poor support for that post-harvest segment of the industry, quality will decline in the course of the season. It's bad news for processors in Cote d'Ivoire who are struggling with lower quality material. So normally they might be expecting a 46, 47 pound, and this year they might be looking at 43, 44, and a lot of the product is lower than that. A factor that we shouldn't discount, and which I've mentioned already, is this cross-border trade. The arrows are red because, strictly speaking, this trade is illegal. It's illegal to export from Cote d'Ivoire by road. It's illegal to export from Benin, to export RCN from Benin. This goes on, and in a certain way, it's acted as a safety valve in both countries for farmers in terms of supporting price and for traders in terms of supporting cash flow. But it is highly impactful. Overall, in this area, the overall reduction in the quantity harvested is nowhere near the rumours are the stories that were floated earlier in the year. Talk of disastrous crops, talks of huge fall in production turned out not to be accurate. And you do wonder at this point, were they in fact designed simply to manipulate prices? Anyway, they had an effect. It wasn't constructive, and they also had an effect on policy. And I would say that the suspension of exports in Côte d'Ivoire was partially a consequence of that. Let's look elsewhere in West Africa. In Burkina, and it did seem that the further north you went in West Africa, that the impact of the weather conditions on the crop was worse. Further north in any individual country, or into Burkina or into Mali. So the estimates of the crop is down, raw cashew nut supply is limited. In Guinea-Bissau, looks like the crop is in, probably not that much left on farms, there may be some. You can track farm gate prices and local warehouse prices as an indicator of that. Estimates, and we don't really know the truth of this yet, but general estimates around about 10% lower, which would make the crop a little bit lower than the 2022 crop. Significantly lower than 2023, but there have been changes in the way the crop is marketed this year, which make it a little bit difficult to track exactly what's happened. And those changes involve Senegal. So if we look in Senegal, what we see first of all is that exports from Senegal this year will be much, much lower than last year. And that's mainly because material from Guinea-Bissau is not flowing across the border into Senegal in the way it did this year. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we come to our last section on policy and regulation. In Senegal, we're looking at a crop around about 40,000 tonnes, I think. Most of that is sold or moved. Processing in Senegal is very limited. There are moves now amongst some stakeholders in the industry to stimulate processing. It is a high quality raw material, and it'll be interesting to see. We do expect in the coming years that production in Senegal will increase. In the Gambia, looks like a good crop. We don't know what's actually grown in the Gambia and what's coming through from Senegal, but about 20,000 tonnes has gone through. That's way lower than it was 10 years ago. At one time, going through the Gambia was almost 100,000 tonnes, which was product from Senegal, product from Guinea-Bissau, product from Mali flowing through the port of Banjul. That's cut back now, and about 20,000 tonnes has gone through the port. Small producer, very good quality, much in demand, probably all sold at this stage. Guinea, crop lower, 10 to 15%. Now again, you have the situation in Guinea where the statistics on production are very unclear. You'll see estimates from 60,000 to 200,000. I track them by trade, and I'm on the way down on the lower end of that. The border trade again plays a part. There's border trade from Guinea-Bissau, and then there's more natural border trade from Mali for evacuation, but also some product comes in from Côte d'Ivoire into areas here. It's not been a great year for processing in Guinea. Processors have closed down. They've struggled with high prices. They've struggled with sources of supply. Hopefully that's a situation that will reverse from next year. So trying to bring that into some kind of overall picture, we're looking at these crop estimates. Now the way I do it is I have a low estimate and I have a high estimate. The high estimate is about 4% below 2023, which would mean, at least in volume terms, it's a pretty good crop. The low estimate would be about 12% below 2023, a much lower crop. So there are differences between the high and the low. What are they? Well, at the moment, I've plugged in 600,000 tonnes for India, maybe on the low side, and 650,000 tonnes on the high side. There still is a discussion about Côte d'Ivoire. We'll see only by the end of the year, but there is a difference of about 100,000 tonnes between estimates. Nigeria, again, about 50,000 tonnes, and then a lot of small differences in a whole range of West African countries. So if we look at this, The difference between the high and the low is about 360,000 tonnes. Half of that is made up in these three countries listed: India, Cote d'Ivoire, and Nigeria. I suppose the other big feature we should mention is that Cambodia has grown in its share of production this year. This year, Cambodia will be 18% of world production, leaving it in second place. So, looking at the estimates, the midpoint between the two is about the 2022 crop, and that may be where we end up when the dust settles and the statistics are collected. During the season, and I think this is the key factor to mention again, estimates went from, in the beginning, a good crop with question marks over the weather. It became, especially in West Africa, predictions became, it's okay, but it's late. Then it went to a very poor crop at different times, particularly in Cote d'Ivoire, but that proved not to be the case. And the final judgment would be that the crop today might be described as better than expected, pretty much everywhere, except perhaps in India. So at least in terms of volume, the crop is not as bad as might have been expected. Now, across West Africa, if we take a general figure, we're looking at about 10% down. That is complicated by the fact that most countries have experienced lower quality. Cote d'Ivoire certainly has, Ghana certainly has, and of course lower quality raw cashew means lower yield. Lower yield means fewer cashew kernels. So 10% down in RCN this year probably translates into something like 12, 13% down overall in terms of kernels availability. If we look at the shares of production, looks like this year West Africa is between 48, 49% total share. East Africa, based on end of 2023, around about 8%. India's 13% falling. Vietnam and Cambodia, about 1/4 of the world's cashews grow in those two countries. Of that, 18% is Cambodia and 7% is Vietnam. So again, to underline, the big feature is that most of the world's cashews grow in areas where they are not processed. Let's have a look at how this production year, this unusual production year, has translated into the raw cashew nut trade. And we will start in Vietnam. Vietnam is the biggest importer of raw cashew nuts and, of course, the biggest exporter of kernels. So we looked at Vietnam's imports from January until the 15th of July, and we compared 2022, 2023, and 2024. And the numbers are very healthy. 1.64 million tonnes imported, almost 8.5% up on 2023 by the 15th of July. This is despite any bans, interruptions, late crops, and so on. So how did that come about? Let's have a look at the monthly imports. So you have month-by-month imports for 3 years, 2022 in the light blue, 2023 in the dark, and in the red 2024. So if you look at 2024, what you see is a relatively slow start and then firing ahead. And this is the impact of Cambodia, of course. March, April, fades away a little bit in May and June, and this is where you may start to see the impact of the late crop in West Africa. But up to the first half of July, and during those first 2 weeks in July, 152,000 tonnes were imported, which is pretty much the same figure as this time last year. So let's have a look at just a time series across this. So I've added here the moving average for 2 months. It's a tight period, so we just take 2 months for 2022 and 2023. Now what we're seeing is that in 2022, a difficult year from a crop perspective, imports peaked early and then faded away as the year goes on. Last year, they were much later. So they peaked June, July, August was a big month too. And then they faded away as you would expect. So looking at this situation, looking at the red bars, we see high early imports, and that means we're not really seeing the impact of the export suspension from Cote d'Ivoire just yet. This may kick in, and you would expect to see it kick in the second half of July. What's also been noticeable is that earlier in the season we saw a lot of, maybe panic isn't too strong a word to use, but we saw a lot of reaction and fears of late shipments, bans, hyping up the price. But then as physical arrivals started to come in May and June, we saw that the physical arrivals had much more impact than the expectations on shipment or fears of delays or fears of a lower crop. And that's just an indicator of just how cash flow driven the cashew sector is. So we could say, well, maybe we actually should put it more correctly and say it's driven by inadequate cash flow and the access to finance in the cashew sector. In a sector in Vietnam that's been struggling, in a sector in West Africa that's for many years struggled for working capital requirements, that the biggest impact on these delays in shipments is on the cash flow, and that's critical. And that can have a very long impact on the sector as a whole. So let's just have a quick look then at imports from Cambodia, and you can see, so the grey is 2024, and you can see 2024 month to month imports in the early part, March, April, way above last year and the year before. A little bit of a slow start. The crop in Cambodia was perhaps a little bit later than expected, but once it got going, big imports. May matched previous years, and then it starts to fade away. So in this period, July through to December, in each of the last 2 years, Cambodia exported around about 50,000 tons. So what's happened is that more cashew nuts have come to Vietnam from Cambodia. They've come earlier because of location, and they're high quality. So that has changed a couple of things. On the one hand, it's changed the available raw material, and some of that raw material may be better suited for the Chinese market than for Western markets, for example. But it's also because you're buying higher priced, more product earlier, it places greater cash flow strains on the industry. So for now at least, Cambodia has filled the gap left by later African crops, and until now it's also filled the gap left by the shorter and the disrupted shipments from West Africa. So let's look at some of the countries that have been supplying Vietnam. And again, the comparison over the 3 years. And you can see that, well, let's look at some of the numbers. So Cambodia's, compared to 2023, an additional 210,000 tons. Tanzania down, Cote d'Ivoire down, but only by 43,000 tons out of 200,000. Ghana slightly up, and Nigeria slightly up. So if we look at this situation overall, what we're seeing is that shipments into Vietnam were down by about 40,000 tons over the period, certainly from the main origins supplying Vietnam. Shipments net, adding the pluses and the minuses together, were down by about 40,000 tons, but Cambodian shipments were up by about 210,000 tons. So this is partially the reason that raw cashew nut prices have stalled, despite the ban and suspension of shipments from Cote d'Ivoire. So let's look at those shipments from Cote d'Ivoire and let's see if we can gain any clues as to what's happened. So again, the 3 years, 2022 in blue, 2023 in orange, and grey is 2024. The trend line is for 2023, and you can see that the trend line tends to peak a little bit later. So this is a 2-month moving average indicating the peak import to Vietnam from Cote d'Ivoire during July, August. That won't happen this year. So when we look at it, we see initially much lower imports from Cote d'Ivoire, and that's the impact of the late crop. Then we see the export suspension coming in the first 10 days of May. Now, what that means, this comes in May, but obviously there's a time lag in shipments. So that's going to impact arrivals in July and arrivals in August. So if the ban had been lifted in June, when it was expected, this impact would have been somewhat alleviated. But because it's lifted rather late, this impact is still to come, but we haven't seen it yet in the import figures in Vietnam. It's in the perception, it's in the belief, but it's not in the numbers just yet. It's too early for that to be seen. Overall, we're seeing the suspension of shipments from the second largest supplier mitigated by additional shipments from Ghana, huge increase from Cambodia, and increased shipments across a range of countries. Simply on what's happened so far, you would say that supply for Vietnamese processors is good, maybe even very good. But it is higher cost because it's from Cambodia. Or is it? Because when we look at the average prices of imports compared 2022, 2023, 2024, January through to the 15th of July, we see that prices are slightly down. So what we're seeing is that the overall import price is about 4% lower. Now just bear in mind that the kernel's price is much higher, at least since May. But although the kernel's import price of RCN is lower, there's more high quality from Cambodia, less volume from West Africa, and what has come from West Africa, in broad terms, is lower quality. So it's not so simple as to say the average import price is lower. You have to factor in there's higher quality from Cambodia, lower quality from West Africa, and generally more from Cambodia and less from West Africa. Bearing in mind also that most of those contracts that are by now shipped and imported were done a long time ago, long before this market started to rise. So let's see if we can get some kind of a impression of the situation in Vietnam. And the big question really is there enough raw cashew nut stock available? Are there enough shipments? Is there enough product to manage until the balance from Cote d'Ivoire arrives? And bear in mind that when the balance from Cote d'Ivoire is shipped, it's going to be more than likely lower quality than it would have been had it been shipped 2 months ago. So I did a bit of a balance sheet. I'm still taking an opening stock unchanged, just under 300,000 tons. That includes work in progress. It includes kernels. It includes everything. I've taken a crop estimate of 315,000 tons, just simply the midpoint between the different estimates. Imports to the middle of July, 1.64 million tons, a record, 8.5% up, as we were saying. We shouldn't forget imports of unpeeled or so-called Burma kernels, which I've taken the kernels figure from Vinacas and converted it into raw cashew nuts for purpose of the balance sheet. And then the big number. And the big number is export. So record exports, we'll talk about that in a little while. But if you take exports and a little bit of domestic consumption, you're looking at about 1.8 million tons. Now, add all of that up, and you get a stock calculated. And this is a calculation, right? I haven't been around the warehouses and counted the bags. This is a calculation. So that would mean from mid-July, there's about 2.5 months of raw cashew nut stock. Is that enough? Tight, at best. So it does look to me as if the Vietnamese supply position for raw cashew nuts will tighten due to a lack of rivals from Cote d'Ivoire, but there is enough stock for the immediate needs. Question, who holds the stock? Is it in the hands of processors? Is it in the hands of importers, traders, speculators? Big question. When will those shipments from Cote d'Ivoire arrive? When will they take place? As I said, the suspension is still in place, 50 days after the first lifting. This is a key factor. If we take all of this, if we take this rate of exports, all of these factors, the balance of stock, it still suggests that Vietnam could buy another 1 million tons. Now that would mean that exports continue at the current rate, that processing continues at the current rate. And of course, those are questions. We'll look at those in a moment. The basic calculation suggests that exports could hit close to the record 2.8 million tons. I'm not sure. Because I'm not sure that exports can continue at this rate, but that's where we stand today. What we are seeing is that if float material is trading at premium prices, that does suggest an expectation that inventories will tighten. And there is, of course, continues to be a temptation on the part of suppliers of low price contracts to delay or to default. In some cases, they have no choice, but in others, contracts have been defaulted and resold. And this needs to be addressed. This needs to be addressed yet again for the future of the sector. It's been going on for as long as I can remember. And in cashews, that's quite a long time now. I think one thing we should say here is that the more we look at the disruption caused by the export suspension in Cote d'Ivoire, the more and more disastrous it looks for the market in 2024. And it may well have impacts for Cote d'Ivoire too. It doesn't seem to have yielded any particular benefits in the domestic processing industry, and it certainly has had a negative effect internationally on reputation, on market stability, and on an orderly marketing of cashew kernels, which long-term is what's needed. Let's have a look at India. So India's imports are up to the end of May. Official figures only, I have till the end of May. Strong start, emphasis on Tanzania in the early part of the year, and falling back now. So when you look at the gap between last year and this year, it's narrowing. These are cumulative figures, so these add up. And this is the total at the end of May, some 385,000 tons. And the gap between this year and last year is quite small. Where did it come from? So let's again look and, why are import figures in India up by 4%? Well, they're up by 4%, mainly because of buying in Tanzania. All of the major West African origins are down. We can see Ivory Coast, we can see Burkina, Guinea, Nigeria, Ghana. Ironically, Benin, where exports are banned, has supplied more cashew nuts to India in 2024 than it did in 2023. That's pretty hard to believe. So the West African origins generally down due to a late crop, high prices, a little bit of a reluctance from processors to commit, a bit of a carry-in stock from last year. Look at some of the numbers and you can see Tanzania almost double. Ivory Coast down by some, 38,000 tons down. And you can see the impact in the different countries. So none of them are big numbers, except the increase imports from Tanzania, which is much more like the 2022 figure than the 2023 figure. And that's what's compensating. 4% up is not a big margin at the end of May, and we might see that just a little bit corrected in June, and then maybe a little bit of a spurt of growth again in July. Look at the average import prices again to the end of May. We're looking at much lower prices. So the difference between 2023 imports and 2024 in India is much bigger because prices generally have been lower. It's much bigger than it is in Vietnam because Vietnam has bought more high quality cashews from Cambodia, substituting what it might have bought from West Africa. So India's lower import cost is due to earlier imports, clever buying, picking the right origins. But it has, of course, at these lower prices meant that there's a huge incentive to profit take and to resell the raw cashew nuts. And many processors have decided to do that. Close the factory, reduce operations, resell the RCN, cash the profit, come back another day. That's happening in a lot of factories, particularly those that are struggling in India, and can have a long-term effect on the industry too. If we look at the India situation, opening stock. So I've put in quite a high figure for opening stock. It's expressed in raw cashew nuts. That's mainly because of the kernel stock, not the RCN. Crop, we're saying in this case, 600,000 tons. Import so far, 385. Consumption. Okay, so that's taking total Indian consumption and trying to distribute it between the first 5 months and the 12 months, coming in at about 650,000 tons for processing. Processing is probably down in India this year. That would give a balance of 785,000 tons, or about 4 months processing stock based on what's happened so far this year. Maybe a little bit lower as the processing gears up for the big festivals in the latter part of the year. So the Indian situation is very fluid right now. There's more questions than answers, to be honest about it. High imports in 2023 had a knock-on effect into this year. India could still need, by my calculations, an additional 650,000 tons. Again, as with Vietnam, if demand holds up, if processing volumes hold up, you could be looking at 650,000 tons, which would mean about the same imports as last year, despite a lower crop. So again, it starts to look like 2022. Small and medium processors reducing processing, reselling their raw cashew nuts. That starts to change the sector a little bit. Interestingly, in India, something that's been, let's say, happening for some time, but we're really seeing it going now. The larger corporate buyers of kernels are on the rise. That means a different kind of contracting. It means maybe some forward contracting. It means a limitation to the number of grades used and increased snack usage. So the Indian consumer market in all products is developing rapidly and becoming more and more segmented, more and more stratified as a market. And this is just one sign of that. It's going to impact the cashew market in the future. That should mean, to suit this kind of demand, to suit this more sophisticated type of demand, that larger processing begins to emerge. And of course, that's in line with mechanization. You do need larger factories to be successful in a mechanized environment. But it will reduce the employment in the sector. And it does mean that in those larger factories, as we've seen elsewhere, including Vietnam, extremely so in West Africa, it needs greater financial capacity, greater access of individual companies to working capital, particularly if they're building a stock and selling it forward. When corporate buyers come into the market, another factor tends to emerge, and that is the need for credit terms. And of course, if people start looking for 30-day, 60-day payment, plus the cost of getting the product to the market, you start to look at increasing working capital needs, interest rates then start to have a much greater bearing on the profitability of the industry. And I think that many of the processors in India who are talking about difficult times, I think they've got a point. That's reducing processing. And reduced processing is likely to keep raw cashew nut prices stable. But it could also lead to occasional peaks and troughs in the market. And I think we may have seen some of that already in India this year. So this reduced processing is a partial answer to the question as to why are Indian buyers not chasing raw cashew nut market when they have a lower crop in their own country. It's just quite a difficult environment. Now, that doesn't mean to say that Indian demand will not rise. I think it will. It doesn't mean to say that the Indian cashew sector won't continue to grow and be strong. I think it will. But it does mean to say that it's changing. And we may well see that play out over the next, this is not going to happen this week or next, this year or next, but over the next 5 to 10 years, I think we're going to see these structural changes. That will also affect the way that raw cashew nuts are bought in African countries. And that's a key impact. Just to point that out for African Cashew Alliance members who are joining us today. So that's the RCN trade. Let's have a look at cashew kernels. Let's have a look at demand and trade. And this is quite interesting. So we start with Vietnam. Again, the leading supplier, big shares in most markets. So they give us a good indication. Again, making the comparison, we can say, first of all, that exports from Vietnam are up by 25% in 2024. 2023 was a record. 2024, so far, is a new record. And in the first half of July, compared to the first half of July of last year, exports up by 28%. That's remarkable. Any way you look at it, this is remarkable. So this is why, despite increased imports, there is a tightness in the supply of raw cashew nuts in Vietnam, simply because processors are exporting more and more every month, every year. And you can see it's consistent throughout the year, with the exception of February. Whereas February is when you see the impact of the Tet Festival. So you can discount it to a certain extent, but that was made up for by January, March, and so on throughout the year. If we look at where those cashew kernels are going, and I break it down into, the way I analyze it is I look at East Asia excluding China. So this will include markets like Japan, Korea, Philippines, Australia. We look at West Asia, which is primarily Middle East and North Africa, Europe, East and West, EU, UK, all European countries, North America, and China as a separate market because it's an interesting market to track. And if we look at the changes, you can see exports to all markets are up. So these are Vietnam's exports of cashew kernels between January and June. And these numbers are tons of kernels. And to look at the increases, East Asia plus 5%, West Asia plus 19%, Europe 19% up, the United States, Canada, Mexico up 24%, and China, it's hard to believe the number, but according to Vietnam Customs, figures which have been shown to be reliable in the past, exports to China are up by 62%. Vietnam is a reliable predictor of the overall market situation because Vietnam has 75% share of Europe, 88% of North America, 95% plus share of China, and significant shares, perhaps 70% in West Asia, and somewhere between 70 and 80% in East Asia. So these are reliable indicators of where the market is going. What are some of the factors involved? So here again is our increases, just to note the remarks. So impact. First of all, higher prices, and we've seen prices rise from $2.40, $3.20s to today, maybe $3.35, $3.20s. these prices can have an impact in markets in the Middle East and markets in China very quickly. Those are not markets which tend to buy forward. They are markets which tend to pass on price increases and decreases, so you get a much faster impact. If we look in Europe and North America, high increase in imports, but there are some indications that in expectation of disruption, longer transit, and emerging restrictions, that early in the year, Europeans and North Americans decided to take some of their shipments a little bit earlier, which processors would have been happy to do because A, prices were low, and B, they were receiving more and more raw material from Cambodia earlier than ever before. In Europe, we see this 19% up on shipments. Now, we're going to look at that in a minute because 19% on shipments does not match import figures to the end of May. So we need to have a little bit of a closer look at that. But the European economy is certainly improving. Germany might be lagging behind a little bit. Germany is a key market in Europe, a country of over 80 million people. Generally improving. The US economy is going from strength to strength at the moment. So those would be factors that would tend to indicate improved imports. I'm not sure about the number for Europe though. Meantime, defaults, delays, the impact of those in the past has been that initially, when you get a lot of contract defaults or renegotiations, initially you get an increase in demand as people come in to replace, renegotiate, buy some more, manage their risk. But as time goes on, it tends to kill off demand growth. So it's not just higher prices, it's the lack of reliability, the default of contract. Why would you buy something if you're not going to get it anyway? Why would you buy something from a supplier who's already owes you multiple containers? So initially, defaults can increase demand, but then as time goes on, they can tend to kill off demand growth. Questions arising on these factors. How will buyers in these festival demand periods, especially in India and China, how will they react to higher prices? Very difficult to say. Will buyers in Europe and the US particularly, will they stop buying forward in the third quarter? So they were really happy to buy as far forward as they could get when markets were lower. Will they continue to do that now, or will they wait and see how the situation evolves in the course of the year? Let's have a closer look at one or two markets. We'll start looking at the US market. So again, US imports, I just tracked 6 years for the purpose of this. And I tracked 6 years because you got to go back a few years to get out of the COVID impact. And therefore we need to kind of leave out 2020, 2021 in order to get a real idea of the trend. But what we do see is month on month, particularly February, March, May, big increases in imports compared to last year. Overall, 5 months imports into the US are up 21%. That is significant, and it does match the pattern of shipments from Vietnam. The pattern also suggests, just the way the containers have arrived, that there may have been some people taking earlier shipments. Now, that could be a factor. I'm not saying it's absolutely a factor in the US, but I think there is an element of that there, which would suggest that inventory levels would be quite healthy rather than a big spike in demand, which would in turn take a little bit of the heat or the impact out of the situation later in the year. All of these imports are at low contracted prices. So that would mean that most imports to the US at low prices, whatever inventory is there, it remains competitive in the market price-wise. All of this looks positive, but comes with a little bit of a health warning. 2022, first 5 months, looked pretty similar, looked very positive. But in the second half of the year, demand crashed. Now, at that time, demand crashed because of economic conditions. If you remember, 2022 was the year that Russia invaded Ukraine, major economic impact of that, a lot of uncertainty, imports fell away. The economy now looks much stronger. You would have to say that. But just keep an eye. We need to be careful of that. The US is important. North America generally is about 18% of world demand. The US is 90% of that. What the impact will be of these higher kernels prices, and of course of the defaults and delays in shipments in the US market, will be critical in deciding future demand. And we're not really now thinking about 2024. We're now starting to think about 2025 because buyers in North America, buyers in Europe will start during August into September. If they haven't already done it, they're starting to look at 2025. Are they seeing encouraging signs? What do higher prices mean? One thing we can say, we can look at the shares. So we are seeing slightly encouraging signs, again, for African cashew processing. First 5 months of this year, Vietnam's share remains rock steady, around about 89%, 88 to 89%, 88.4, I think it is. Brazil's share is down now, less than 2%. That was unthinkable 20 years ago. Interesting news. African share in 2023 was 6.5%. In the first 5 months of 2024, 8.5%. That's an increase of 30%. Very positive news. We haven't seen growth in African processors' share of the US market for some time, but we are seeing it in the first 5 months of this year. Let's hope it continues.